as we celebrate the inauguration of a museum dedicated to all the Prime Ministers of India, it would be worth evaluating them on the basis of how they dealt. And one of the best sources for the purpose is the annual Independence Day speeches since 1947. The addresses from the ramparts of the Red Fort provide a unique insight into different Prime Ministers' views on the government and for the country, and their underlying philosophy on various topics. Will it surprise you if your Prime Minister stood at the Red Fort and said that you're a lazy people? This was said by India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, in 1959.
हिंदुस्तान में काफ़ी मेहनत करने की आदत आम तौर से नहीं हुई। हमारा कसूर नहीं, आदतें ऐसी पड़ जाती हैं वाक़यात से, लेकिन बात यह है कि हम उतना काम नहीं करते जितना कि यूरोप वाले या जापान वाले या चीन वाले या रूस वाले कहीं करते या अमेरिका वाले। ये न समझिए कि वो कौमें खुशहाल हो गईं कोई जादू से, मेहनत से हुई हैं और अकल से हुई हैं। तो हम भी मेहनत और अकल से बढ़ सकते हैं, कोई और चारा नहीं।
This attitude had percolated into the government systems, the bureaucracy, and for years the problems of the people remained neglected. In a bid to maintain a peaceful international image, Prime Minister Nehru stated this.
और जो लोग इस बात को वहाँ जा रहे हैं, मुबारक हो उनको जाना, लेकिन ये याद रखें कि सत्याग्रही अपने को कहते हैं तो सत्याग्रह के उसूल और सिद्धांत और रास्ते भी याद रखें। सत्याग्रही के पीछे फौजें नहीं चलती हैं, न फौजों की पुकार होती है।
And barely 10 years after the partition, where Pakistan had already attacked and occupied the territory of India that stands as POK today, Nehru, in his address in 1959, calls this rival nation a piece of our heart.
हमारे पड़ोसी मुल्क हैं पाकिस्तान, जो एक हमारी टुकड़े, हमारे दिल के और बाजू के टुकड़े। कैसे हम सोचें उनसे लड़ना, ये तो एक अपने को ही एक नुकसान पहुंचाना है। और अगर वो हिमाकत से समझें अदावत करना हमसे, तो वो अपने को नुकसान पहुंचाएं। ये अजीब रिश्ता है हिंदुस्तान का और पाकिस्तान का, अजीब रिश्ता के रंजिश भी हो, एक दूसरे के खिलाफ कभी कभी कुछ गुस्सा भी चढ़े, लेकिन आखिर में वो रिश्ता इतना करीब का, हजारों बरस का, कि कानूनों से वो नहीं मिट सकता है। और अगर कोई ज़रा नुकसान हिंदुस्तान को हो, यकीनन वो पाकिस्तान को उसका नुकसान है, और पाकिस्तान को हो तो हिंदुस्तान का। इसलिए हम चाहते हैं कि हम अमन से रहें, दोस्ती से रहें, पाकिस्तान से हमारे रिश्ते बढ़ें।
Now imagine this, your nation is at war. What do you expect your Prime Minister to say in his Independence Day speech? To honor the sacrifices of the soldiers, to give a detailed account to the masses about what happened and why it happened. But Prime Minister Nehru didn't do that. Instead, after India's crushing defeat at the hands of the Chinese, he spun the war into a positive episode.
हमें तकलीफ हुई, परेशानी हुई, लेकिन उसका भी नतीजा एक अच्छा हुआ। वो ये कि उसने हमें इस गफलत से निकाला और सारे मुल्क में एक नई हवा फैली, नई हवा चढ़ी और लोग एक तैयार होने लगे और हर तरफ एक जोश था और एक कुर्बानी की जाती थी, त्याग किया जा रहा है।
During Prime Minister Nehru's tenure, inflation was a rampant problem. But instead, Prime Minister Nehru resorted to diversion and blame and provided no solution. For example, in 1958, he makes a blanket remark on traders in the country, labeling them as unscrupulous, dishonest people. Here's what he said in his address from the Red Fort.
परेशानी की बात यह है कि हमारे मुल्क में काफ़ी लोग ऐसे हैं जो अब तक पैसा बनाने की कोशिश करते हैं दूसरे की मुसीबत से, जो चाहे वो व्यापारी हो या दुकानदार हो या और हो, खुद गर्जी में जमा करते हैं खाने का सामान ताकि ज़्यादा दाम मिले या कभी साल 2 साल बाद उन्हें ज़रूरत हो तो उसको काम में ला सकें.
In 1950, Prime Minister Nehru also said that with independence comes responsibility and that Indians did not understand the meaning of freedom.
चाहे खतरा बाहर का हो या अंदर का हो, लेकिन फिर मैं आपसे कहता हूँ, आज़ाद हिंदुस्तान है, आज़ाद हिंदुस्तान की सालगिरह हम मनाते हैं, लेकिन आज़ादी के साथ जिम्मेदारी होती है. जिम्मेदारी हुकूमत की खाली नहीं, जिम्मेदारी हर एक आज़ाद शख्स की. और अगर आप उस जिम्मेदारी को महसूस नहीं करते, अगर आप समझते नहीं, हिंदुस्तान की जनता सब पूरी तौर से आप आज़ादी के माने नहीं समझे और आप आज़ादी को पूरी तौर से बचा नहीं सकते जब खतरा आए.
The issue was that Nehru mentioned the problem of inflation year after year in his Independence Day addresses. In 1948, he said inflation oppresses the people. In 1950, he said there is a war in Korea, therefore price rise. In 1951, he again blames it on Korea and adds that if there is some talk in America, then that affects the prices of commodities. 8 years later, in 1959, he says, and I quote, "This isn't in our total control yet, but we will control it." The problem of inflation persisted for that many years, but little did he do to mitigate the problem. Years later, the same approach was seen in Prime Minister Indira Gandhi's Independence Day address, where industrialists were considered crooks. This is her speech from 1968, where she said, and I quote, "When we talk of indiscipline among workers, I would like to say that industrialists and moneyed businessmen cannot escape responsibility. They cannot ensure discipline if they continue to make big profits and draw fat salaries. I would appeal to them to give thought to this problem and find a solution." And in 1971, she says,
कभी कभी कोई किसी चीज़ की कमी होती है तो उसके दाम बढ़ते हैं और वो समझा जाता है, लेकिन कभी कभी एक वस्तु पे टैक्स लगता है और दूसरी वस्तु जिनका ज़रा भी उससे संबंध नहीं है उनके दाम भी बढ़ जाते हैं. कौन बढ़ाता है, क्यों बढ़ते हैं?
a solution to battle inflation was to grow vegetables in pots. In 1975, she went on to compare the emergency with India's Independence Day in 1947.
मुझे खुशी है कि हमने जब से ये आपातकाल की घोषणा की, कोई खुशी से नहीं की जैसे मैंने आपसे कहा, लेकिन ऐसी स्थिति उत्पन्न हुई थी कि हम मजबूर हो गए.
ध्वनि संग्रहालय की रिकॉर्डिंग है.
जैसे कहते हैं कि हर काली बादल के पीछे रोशनी होती है, वैसे कभी कभी एक कठोर कदम भी लेना हो, जैसे बीमारी में कड़वी दवा भी पीनी पड़ती है, तो उससे लाभ उठाना चाहिए कि फिर से स्वस्थ हो जाएं. और इस काम में आज सबको पड़ना है. कैसे देश की राजनीति को, देश की अर्थव्यवस्था को, देश के हर जीवन के हर क्षेत्र में कैसे हम सफाई लाएं, सौंदर्य लाएं और एक नवीनता भी लाएं. ये समय है एक माने में जब पहले दफे जन झंडा फहराया गया था. यहाँ नहीं था, आपको याद होगा कि वो एक दूसरी जगह पे इंडिया गेट पर फहराया था पहले दफे स्वतंत्र भारत का झंडा.
Essentially, how Prime Minister Nehru spun India's defeat against the Chinese into a positive event, Indira Gandhi did the same with emergency. Meanwhile, inflation was on the rise. After 17 years of Prime Minister Nehru's rule, it was expected that the government would have found a solution.
फिजूल खर्ची अगर न हो, अगर लोग तैयार न हो कि कितने भी दाम बढ़े वो खरीदारी करते ही चले जाएं, चाहे उस वस्तु की आवश्यकता हो या नहीं, इससे वातावरण बिगड़ता है।
Rajiv Gandhi's Independence Day speeches were largely focused on the same rhetoric of Garibi Hatao and a disdain towards industrialists that was very much reflected in his policies. 12 years after his mother imposed the emergency, the streak of an authoritarian ruler was seen in Rajiv Gandhi, who threatened the free press. Moving on, let's picture a situation where someone tells you, if it wasn't for my forefathers, you'd be standing with a begging bowl.
पहली बार हमें दूसरों के दरवाजे पे बर्तन लेके पहुंचना नहीं पड़ा। ये गौरव की बात है, ये शान की बात है और ये हम कर पाए हैं क्योंकि 40 साल से जो पंडित जी ने, इंदिरा जी ने काम किया था, उसका नतीजा आज हमारे सामने है।
With regards to industrialists, Rajiv Gandhi had the same view as that of Indira Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru.
इंदिरा जी ने अपना पूरा जीवन लगा दिया समाजदार शक्तियों की लड़ाई में, उनका सामना करने में, उन्हें खत्म करने में।
Strangely, in his tenure of 5 years, not once did he invoke Indira Gandhi's assassination or publicly refer to her as my mother. But in 1989, he spoke at length about her assassination, that in what would be his last Independence Day speech. Today, it has become quite a fashion to deny the genocide of Kashmiri Hindus. But Narasimha Rao's Independence Day speech confirmed the Pakistan-backed terrorism that was at its peak in Kashmir at that time.
कश्मीर के सिलसिले में और जो पाकिस्तान एक तरफ प्रचार करता है कि ह्यूमन राइट्स का वहाँ वायलेशन हो रहा है, मानवीय अधिकारों का उल्लंघन हो रहा है। अभी 2 दिन पहले, बहुत दूर की बात नहीं है, 2 दिन पहले वहाँ के आतंकवादियों ने एक बस को बीच में रोका और उसमें 16-17 आदमियों को उतारकर उन लोगों को गोली मार दी। इनके गोली के जो शिकार हुए, क्या उनके मानवीय अधिकार नहीं है? उनको जिंदा रहने का हक नहीं है? ये केवल इन्हीं आतंकवादियों को है।
In 1994 again, in his speech, Rao admitted to merciless killing of people in Kashmir. But little did his government do to solve the worsening situation. Evident from the fact that this was his 4th Independence Day speech as the Prime Minister, but he was still asking questions instead of providing answers. In 1998, the BJP came to power with Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who became the Prime Minister. In his first speech as Prime Minister, Vajpayee spoke of the nuclear test India did in Pokhran in the month of May, barely 2 months after his election. He invoked Indira Gandhi as well, crediting her for beginning India's nuclear program, and also saluted the talented scientists and the defense forces for achieving the feat. The nuclear weapon did not become a political points-scoring exercise, but in a display of his bipartisan politics. In his 1998 address, Atal Bihari Vajpayee said this:
हमें ये कभी नहीं भूलना चाहिए कि हम एक राष्ट्र के नागरिक हैं। लद्दाख से लेकर निकोबार तक फैला हुआ है ये देश, गारो पर्वत से लेकर गिलगित तक इसका विस्तार है। ये एक प्राचीन देश है, इसकी सभ्यता और संस्कृति 5000 वर्ष से भी अधिक पुरानी है।
It will be important to note here that Atal Bihari Vajpayee and Narendra Modi are the only prime ministers to have referred to Pak-occupied Kashmir in their speeches. Moving on to the Manmohan Singh era from the year 2004 to 2014. An interesting bit to note here is that this was perhaps the first time in the history of independent India that a serving Prime Minister referred to his party president during the Independence Day speech. In this case, Sonia Gandhi, a clear indication of where the power center lied. In 2008, this is what he said.
हमारी पूर्व प्रधानमंत्री श्रीमती इंदिरा गांधी जी ने कहा था गरीबी हटा। हमारी नेता श्रीमती सोनिया गांधी ने हमें नारा दिया है रोजगार बढ़ा।
Now can you imagine what if a Prime Minister connected minorities with terror in the country? In a bid to appease minorities, he withdrew the quota in 2005 passed during Vajpayee era. He said it is essential that minorities should have every opportunity to carry on their daily activities with a feeling of security and happiness. This is also our goal. Hence, we have repealed quota. As a result, many sections of the society are able to breathe easily. Seemingly, the goal was to divide the society, appease minorities while severely compromising national security. The period 2006 to 2009 was marred by terror attacks in India. Terrorism in general found a mention in his speeches. In August 2008, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh mentions in his speech, and I quote, "If this issue of terrorism is not addressed, all the good intentions that we have for our two peoples to live in peace and harmony will be negated. We will not be able to pursue the peace initiatives we want to take. The terrorists and those who support them are enemies of the people of India and Pakistan, of friendship between the two countries, and of peace in the region and the world. We must defeat them." 3 months later, 26/11 happened. Terror attacks, inflation, corruption. By 2011, the UPA too was under tremendous pressure owing to a string of scams that were surfacing. In his speeches in the remaining years, he admits his government's corruption. But then, meanwhile, a series of blasts jolted Mumbai again on 13th July 2011. A month later, in his Independence Day address, he said, and I quote, "Last month, terrorist attacks in Mumbai warn us that there cannot be any slip-up in our vigilance as far as the fight against terrorism is concerned." By 2011, India was battling inflation in double digits. But if we look at Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's speech, he had already provided the justification for this years ago. Dr. Singh, the economist, seemed to have forgotten that even the poor will be facing inflation. This was his theory that he presented to the nation in his 2006 Independence Day address.
हमें ये बात समझनी होगी कि यदि हम चाहते हैं कि हमारे किसानों की आमदनी बढ़े तो उनकी पैदा की गई वस्तुओं की कीमतें कुछ ना कुछ बढ़ेंगी। जब समाज के दूसरे वर्गों की आमदनी बढ़ती है तो हमारे किसानों की आमदनी क्यों ना बढ़े।
Year 2014, Narendra Modi-led BJP stormed to power with an absolute majority. In his very first speech from the ramparts of the Red Fort, Prime Minister Modi, in a display of his bipartisan spirit, credits all the previous Prime Ministers of India.
आजादी के बाद देश आज जहां पहुंचा है उसमें इस देश के सभी प्रधानमंत्रियों का योगदान है, इस देश की सभी सरकारों का योगदान है, इस देश के सभी राज्यों की सरकारों का भी योगदान है.
This reflects in the recently inaugurated Prime Minister's Museum as well, where all Prime Ministers have been given space. From Nehru's lazy people remark nearly 70 years ago to this day, a stark contrast can be drawn. Prime Minister Narendra Modi said in his 2019 address,
हम में से किसी से भी ज्यादा विपरीत परिस्थितियों में जूझने की ताकत अगर किसी में है तो मेरे गरीब भाइयों बहनों में है। कितनी ठंड क्यों न हो, वो मुट्ठी बंद करके गुजारा कर सकता है। जिसके भीतर ये सामर्थ्य है, आइए उस सामर्थ्य के हम पुजारी बने और इसलिए उसकी रोजमर्रा की जिंदगी की कठिनाइयों को हम दूर करें।
If we look at the approach towards wealth creators, Prime Minister Modi's view was more positive in comparison to previous Prime Ministers, Nehru, Indira and Rajiv Gandhi, who were openly anti-businesses. Here's what he said in 2019.
हमारे देश में कुछ ऐसी गलत मान्यताओं ने घर कर लिया है। उन मान्यताओं से बाहर निकलना पड़ेगा। जो देश की वेल्थ को क्रिएट करता है, जो देश के वेल्थ क्रिएशन में कंट्रीब्यूट करता है, वे सब देश की सेवा कर रहे हैं। हम वेल्थ क्रिएटर को आशंका की नजरों से न देखें।
One thing to be noticed here is that Prime Minister Modi has been giving a report card of his government's performance each year in his Independence Day speeches, showing his responsible attitude and the accountability his government has towards the people of the country. What Prime Minister Modi says each year turns into a social revolution. In his first speech from the ramparts of the Red Fort, he gave a clarion call for Swachh Bharat that to date resonates in the mind of every Indian. Similarly, year on year, he has used the occasion to launch new welfare and policy initiatives like Jan Dhan Yojana, electrification under Saubhagya, Make in India, Ujjwala, Jal Jeevan Mission, Digital India, Atmanirbhar Bharat, Gati Shakti and many more. His speeches are rich in data and details, aimed at informing the public about the undertakings of his government. To sum it all up, if we look at Prime Ministers Nehru, Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi, the Independence Day addresses were high on rhetoric, light on data, blaming masses and all the other factors but themselves for their government's shortcomings. Subsequently, Prime Ministers Narasimha Rao, Dr. Manmohan Singh adopted a similar approach in governance that reflected in their Independence Day addresses. We'd like to tell you here that these were the Prime Ministers who served India the longest. If we talk about Prime Minister Narendra Modi's speeches in the last 7 years, there's energy, celebration of Indianness, reforms, his government's performance updates, and a comprehensive roadmap for India's growth.